so this is the muscular system. So here are the goals of the chapter. So first of all, we want to be able to describe the functions and the relations between prime movers, antagonists, synergists, and fixators, and also be able to give examples. And we want to be able to list the criteria that are used to name muscles and give examples of those. We also want to know what a lever is and what a lever working at a mechanical advantage is and how this differs from a lever working at a mechanical disadvantage. And there are 3 lever systems, and for each we want to know the name, arrangement, and advantages. And we want to know common patterns of muscle fascicle arrangement and how they relate to power generation. Lastly, we want to be able to name and identify the muscles, the major muscles of the human body. So these are the word roots. They're pretty self-explanatory. You basically just have to memorize them, but these examples, like the examples are helpful, but these ones are mostly anatomical examples because most of them are terms that are muscles, like the sternocleidomastoid. That's a muscle that's in the chapter. But a lot of times having your own examples might be helpful. Like, for example, brevis, it means short. So if you know the word brevity is an English word, that stem is also using that word. So that might help you remember. So you can think of your own examples to help. But these are just examples that actually relate to the chapter. Anyway, this is the images section, which I'm just going to skip through. But quickly, some of these muscles you may know for their general terms. Like, for example, you may identify that as the quadricep muscle, but these are the anatomical terms. So actually, the quadricep, in fact, is called the rectus femoris. Hamstring over here, biceps femoris. So these are the anatomical definitions. And we're just going to skip through these. I mean, basically, you're going to have to come back and just memorize all of these. It's just memorization of the muscles. These images here are actually the cat muscles, which you're going to, when you dissect the cat, you would see these muscles in the cat. Anyway, so here are just all the definitions. These definitions are spread out through the book because they relate to the goals that you do. The goals where you have to know certain things. These words are spread out throughout the chapter. But here I just have them all on one page. So I don't know, maybe if you're doing flashcards, this will be a good place to go to because you can just have all the definitions if you were going to memorize them. And here is the connections to the body system. So this is important because, all the systems of the body work together, but this page specifically shows how the muscular system affects the cardiovascular system, the skeletal system, and the integumentary system. So it affects the cardiovascular system because when you exercise and increase your cardiovascular fitness, there's all these processes going on in your body, obviously, when you're exercising, and there's increased blood flow to the heart, and over time, that actually causes the left ventricle to adapt to all this extra blood coming to it. So when there's all this extra blood, it grows larger to adapt to that, and then it can actually hold more blood since it's larger, obviously, and therefore can eject more blood for each beat. So if you have the amount of blood stays the same, but if you can eject more blood for each beat, you need less beats. So that's why, if you take the heart rate of someone who's very fit, then it's going to be lower. They don't need to have as many beats to get the same amount of blood moving throughout their body. And in turn, the cardiovascular system affects the muscular system because when you're running, it gives oxygen and other nutrients to muscles or any kind of exercise. But then for the skeletal system, the muscles pull on the bones of the body, which increases their strength and helps determine their bone strength. And in turn, bones provide levers for muscles. So that's how the skeletal system helps out the muscular system. And then for the integumentary system, muscular exercise aids circulation to the skin and improves health. So, exercising helps your blood flow and whatnot, and that is going to improve the health of your skin. And in turn, skin protects the muscles. So, here's the actual information. Oh, and one important thing, for some background information to note, is that there's 3 different kinds of muscle: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. But when we're talking about the muscular system, we're talking about skeletal muscle. We're not talking about cardiac or smooth. Anyway, so for the first goal, we want to be able to identify these. And one important thing to note, just for some background information here, is that it's not like you have a certain muscle that, like, you can't say, like, you can't say the quadriceps are a prime mover. Like, you can't just categorize them as a prime mover. Like, in a specific exercise, the quadriceps might be the prime mover, but everything is relative to the movement. Like, it's not just the quadriceps are a prime mover. So, for example, if you look at hip flexion in running, here you can see that the runner's right leg is in hip flexion. This leg right here, it's up. Not completely, but it's driving up there. Partial hip flexion, at least. Anyway, so in hip flexion, the psoas, the hip flexor, which is right around there, that hip muscle, is the prime mover, because that is what is providing the major force to bring the leg up, like the hip flexor. It's the main force that drives this leg up. So that's why that's the prime mover here, but you can't just say, oh, the hip flexor is a prime muscle. No, it's not a prime mover. It's a prime mover only in this action. Maybe in other actions too, but anyway. And then the quadricep acts as a synergist muscle, because the quadricep isn't the main force that's driving this leg up, but it's helping the hip flexor. So, yeah, that's why it's a synergist. And in this particular motion of hip flexion, the gluteus maximus muscle, which is on the opposite side of the hip flexor, it's the antagonist, because it opposes this movement. Like, the antagonist is usually, like, on the opposite side of the prime mover, because it opposes the motion. So, like, this will make sense more when you look at the next thing, hip extension, which is the opposite leg. This left leg here is in hip extension. Since the gluteus is opposing hip flexion and is the antagonist, it is therefore the prime mover for the opposite, hip extension. And so hip extension, the glutes are the prime movers. So then in turn, the hip flexors are the antagonists of hip extension. So here in hip extension, the glutes are the prime movers, and the hip flexors over here, you can't really see them because the left leg's in the way, but the hip flexors on the other side, they are actually the antagonist in this movement right here, whereas in the opposite movement right here, they are the prime movers. And the rectus abdominis in basically both hip flexion and hip extension, because that's just a fixator, which fixators work to oftentimes stabilize the body. So the abs, when you're running, they stabilize your body. If your abs aren't engaged, like if you ever try leaning forward, like not engaging your abs, like just stand up, try leaning forward, and then try to bring up your knee, I can guarantee that you will not be able to get your knee as high as if you were standing up straight, because if you're standing up straight, then the rectus abdominis is going to engage, and that will work to be a fixator and stabilize your body. Yeah. And anyway, another example of this is if you look at bicep flexion versus tricep extension. Like, these are opposites, just like hip flexion and hip extension, because in the bicep curl, the prime mover is the bicep and the tricep is the antagonist. And it's vice versa in tricep extension. And then here I also listed the synergists and, the fixators. Anyway, so the next goal, of course, is to be able to list the criteria that is used to name muscles and also be able to give examples. So, the first criteria we use to name muscles is the location of the muscle. For example, the rectus abdominis, you can see it in this picture, it's located in the abdominal region where you have all your abdominal muscles. There's the rectus abdominis, transverse abdominis, obliques, all of them in the abdominal region. So that is why you call it the rectus abdominis. Then there is shape. So, for example, the deltoid muscle, which it's not in any of these pictures specifically pointed out, but oh wait. Yes, it is actually. It's right there. So the deltoid muscle, it's somewhat triangular. I mean, if you look at it that way. So deltoid means triangle. So there you go. Your deltoid. And then size. So the gluteus maximus is a very large muscle. So it is called the gluteus maximus. Whereas the gluteus minimus is smaller. So it is called the gluteus minimus. And also, direction, the direction that the muscle is running in, can be used to classify the muscle. So, for example, your rectus abdominis, back to your rectus abdominis, it is running straight up and down across your body. See how it just straight right there? And so that is why it is called rectus, because rect means straight, which you saw in your word roots, okay? So rect means straight. To remember that, you can think of the word erect, standing straight up, like stand with your spine erect. And then oblique indicates that the muscles run slanted. So in this picture, it's kind of hard to see the way that they run, but the oblique muscles actually, they're not straight up and down. They come to your body at sort of a slanted angle. So that's why they're called obliques. And another way to classify them is the number of origins. So, the origin, that's just like the beginning of the muscle, like where the muscle begins, the head of the muscle, if you will. So, the bicep, it has 2 different heads. So, bi meaning 2. Tricep, 3 different heads. Tri means 3. So, that's one way to name muscles. And next is the location of the attachment. So, for example, if you would look at the sternocleidomastoid, which is, that's actually this muscle in the neck here. And it has origins on the neck. The heads, or origins, are in the neck. And also the clavicle, which is the collarbone right there. And, it inserts into the mastoid. So that's the sternocleidomastoid. It has all of those components in its name. And lastly, another criterion for naming muscles is the action of the muscles. So, for example, the adductor longus adducts the thigh. So adduct, that just means to bring towards the midline of your body. So, if I were to move this leg closer to my body, like inward, then that would be adduction. But if I were to take this leg and push it out this way as if to kick the camera, that would be abduction. So a lot of times, like, we can say, like, adductor longus, the muscle that can bring it in towards the midline of the body. And then if we were to say, like, there's an abductor longus muscle, that would do exactly the opposite, bring it outwards. And that might be another example, just, connecting everything. That could be an example of a prime mover and an antagonist. So there you go for that. But anyway, so the next goal, what is a lever and how levers operating at a mechanical advantage differ from the levers working at a mechanical disadvantage. Okay, so here are these definitions that we saw before. So lever system, basically just a partnership between the muscular system and the skeletal system. And how this works is that the load itself is the bone like that would be the load, and all the overlying tissues, which is why